Some good news for Autónomos in Spain, as the government has agreed to implement an income threshold below which self-employed people will not be required to charge VAT on their invoices to customers. This will simplify admin and bureaucracy for self-employed people and will bring Spain in line with other EU countries who have similar thresholds in place. But what does it mean for those Autónomos that are eligible for this, and is it the right choice for them? That's what I'm going to talk about as we get into this video. So let's get right into it. All right, so to provide some context to this news story, back in 2020, the EU introduced a directive that saw member states across the EU implement a revenue threshold below which self-employed workers in those countries did not have to charge and pass on VAT to the respective tax authorities of those countries, with the deadline for implementation being the 31st of December 2024. And whilst almost every EU country followed this directive and implemented thresholds, I'll put some on the screen so that you can see what they look like across different countries, Spain stood out as a country that did not implement that threshold, meaning that self-employed workers in Spain had, and still have today, the obligation of charging VAT on their invoices to customers. And this issue has been raised and brought up in Spain over the past year or so, particularly by the ATA, the Asociación de Trabajadores Autónomos, which would translate to essentially the Self-Employed Workers Association, and actually reached the point of the European Commission taking legal action against Spain. However, in the previous weeks, the government have agreed to implement this threshold at 85,000 euros. So what that means is self-employed people who invoice less than 85,000 euros per year in revenue would be exempt essentially from applying the VAT concept on their invoices. Now, how this works essentially is that VAT is a sales tax that is charged on the good or service that's being sold. The most common rate that you'll see in Spain is 21% on the majority of goods and services, but it can go down to 10 or as low as 4% even, depending on what sector and what kind of goods and services are being sold. And so that VAT is something that the buyer essentially pays on the good and service that's being sold to them. And then the business, or the self-employed person in this case, essentially collects that VAT, that sales tax, and then passes it on to the government. And in Spain, that's done on a quarterly basis through the 303 model, the Modelo 303, essentially. And so with this exemption, self-employed workers essentially are no longer under the obligation to put the VAT concept on their invoice as they send it on to the client, provided they're under that threshold. And that 85,000 threshold is for Autónomos that are operating in Spain. If a self-employed person is doing cross-border EU transactions, that threshold can increase up to 100,000 euros as well. And accepting this exemption is not automatic and is voluntary. That means that as a self-employed person, you can apply for that VAT exemption provided you meet the criteria, or you can decide not to. And now with that, let's talk about why someone might decide to ask for this exemption, or why they might decide not to apply for this exemption. Because there's a key detail that I haven't mentioned up to this point that could sway one way or the other for you. And it's that up to this point, we've only talked about VAT on sales invoices. We haven't talked about VAT on expense invoices, which as a self-employed person, if you're charging VAT on your invoices to customers, you can essentially deduct the VAT from expenses from the VAT you've collected on sales. Let's say you're an Autónomo here charging VAT and you sell something for 200 euros. Your VAT, if we assume the 21% rate in Spain, would be 42 euros. So your invoice would show 242 euros. Then let's say that you have an expense of 121 euros, including the VAT. So that would be 21 euros. So what that means is you would have collected 42 euros of VAT from the customer. But at the same time, when you paid for that good or service that is in the expense, you would have paid 21 euros of VAT, meaning that that VAT is essentially already paid for, and that can be used to reduce the VAT that you've collected from the client. So you would only end up passing on 21 euros net of VAT in that instance. What's the catch if you go through this VAT exemption scheme is that yes, you don't have to charge VAT to your customers anymore, but it means that you can't deduct VAT from expenses that you've already paid. It means that that VAT has to be passed on. And so for self-employed workers who have a lot of VAT deductions or have a lot of business expenses, if they were to opt into that scheme, they would no longer be able to deduct all that VAT from their expenses. So they may actually end up worse off in that respect if they were to opt into that exemption scheme and they had a lot of fixed costs. Whereas someone who is maybe a service provider, for example, and doesn't have a lot of fixed costs or very minimal expenses, they may be more positioned to benefit from this because they'll be able to price themselves more competitively and in a way that's more beneficial to them, at the same time as having a handful of expenses, and they probably won't feel the impact of that VAT since it's only one or two items that they would be able to deduct it from versus what they're charging for their goods or services. And what I mean by the pricing being more beneficial for them is that at the end of the day, what the customer pays is probably not going to change that much, depending on how these self-employed people price their services. But what the self-employed person gets to keep is essentially going to be more, because if they don't have to apply that VAT to the invoice, then they can, in theory, let's say, charge the same price, but not essentially have to set aside 21% in VAT to pass on to the tax authorities. And they can essentially, that's money for them that stays in their pocket at the end of the day, is where I'm getting at. That said, coming back to who it may not be fully beneficial for is, again, entrepreneurs or self-employed people who are doing cross-border EU business, because a lot of these companies, they may request a VAT number for reverse charge purposes. But that's a very specific detailed topic that I'll not get into in this video. And so weighing all of this up, I think it's a positive step in the right direction for self-employed people to not have to deal with as much bureaucracy and hassle every quarter to declare their VAT transactions. It's one less declaration to worry about. And as I said, if you've got people who are below the threshold, they can price their services in such a way that they end up with more money at the end of the day, which I think is overall a good thing. Those are essentially the key benefits. What it doesn't address, of course, are still the challenges of the social security contribution system that Autónomos face, which I've talked about in a past video, where it's very much income based, and depending on how much you earn, that can be minimum a third of your income is going to social security. In some of the better cases, 30-25% because of the proportionality of the system. But that minimum social security quota, once you get past the first year of the Tarifa Plana of 80 euros per month, which is okay, let's say, you're looking at a minimum of like 230 euros per month in social security contributions that you're going to have to give, which has a much bigger impact on the net income of a self-employed worker in Spain, more than, exempting them from collecting VAT. And as I alluded to in the previous section of the video, yes, there will be people that benefit from this, and that's great for them, but it won't necessarily be beneficial for everybody. So it's really on a case-by-case basis. Self-employed people will have to run the numbers and work out if the VAT exemption will be more beneficial for them than being able to deduct VAT based on their business expenses. Nevertheless, a step in the right direction though. And I should say as well, as I'm doing this video, if you're an autonomo and you are looking for help with your monthly accounting, with your bureaucracy and paperwork and admin as an autonomo, then be sure to check out the video description where I'll leave a link to a number of service providers who can help you, whether that's a DIY gestoria like Solo, where you can essentially do your accounting yourself, or if you prefer a more personal treatment, then a provider like ProSpain Consulting can also help you as a self-employed person with your monthly, quarterly and annual obligations. There you go guys, that's this news story explained. I hope you found it informative and useful. Leave a comment and let me know what you think about this measure, and if you're an autonomo and what you're thinking of doing as a result of this. And if you like this video and you want to see more about self-employment and working in Spain in general, then be sure to check out these two videos here. So next time I'll see you on the next one, and let's get this money.